Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the responsible business podcast from Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years leading responsible business issue discussions within the European Parliament, I lead our debates here about corporate responsibility and sustainability, sustainable finance, business, and human rights. Today, there's been a huge political discourse about human rights due diligence by companies, but we're going to delve under the surface to what due diligence really means and how it is best done. And we're going to do so with one of the international retail companies that is best prized and best estimated within the practice. We're going to welcome to the discussion ALDI South Group. It's in the top 50 of the corporate human rights benchmark and is assessed as meeting the Ethical Trading Initiative base code. So no company better to help be our guide. And our guide himself is Niklas Wehner, who is Director Corporate Responsibility International for the ALDI South Group. Niklas, very much warm welcome to Frankly Speaking.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, let's go through the different steps in undertaking due diligence. I know some of our audience will know that back to front, but we're going to see what it means in detail for your company. And I suppose just at the outset, just give us a sort of headline. What is your company's approach to due diligence?
Absolutely. So maybe why are we doing due diligence actually? Simply put, for us, it's very central to how we want to operate as a retailer. Simplicity, consistency, and responsibility are core values of the ALDI South Group. And also our business model is quite simple: great quality at the best price, fair and honest product offers, and efficient business processes. So in everything that we do, we take responsibility seriously towards the customer, business partners, employees, the community, and the environment. We operate in Europe, the UK, US, Australia, and China, and we also source a great deal of different products from around the world, from bananas and coffee in Latin America to seafood and textiles in South and Southeast Asia, just to name a few. So risks such as forced labor, child labor, and barriers to freedom of association remain quite present in many global supply chains. And this means that proactive due diligence is really essential to uphold also our commitments towards human rights and the environment. And in order to fulfill our responsibility, we conduct due diligence in line with widely accepted international instruments, such as the UN Guiding Principles. And as we build on more than 15 years of voluntary due diligence commitments, it's also fair to say that now the regulatory environment is really becoming a lot more complex across all geographies that we operate in, with increasing requirements for due diligence and transparency. But we do believe that due diligence in line with international instruments remains really the most effective way for us to honor our commitments, to uphold human rights, and adapt also to this evolving legal landscape in which we operate, which is not always consistent, but we are seeing some movements into the right direction here, hence why also our company was actually quite happy when we saw the debate picking up at level of the European Union to introduce a new instrument with the CSDDD.
Okay, we're going to come back to that later, I promise. But I still want to focus very much on the practice within the company. Yes. Now, it's very difficult for companies publicly to talk about adverse impacts, but the guiding principles, as you've just referenced, require us all to investigate potential and actual adverse impacts for the company in the sorts of global supply chains you've described. Of course, there are adverse impacts there. You, I, and all of our audience know that. So how do you go about identifying them? And perhaps give us a particular example.
Of course. So first, I'd like to start with reiterating it's an evolving process. You learn really with every iteration of what you do to refine your processes and also become more targeted in your activities. But it's at the heart of it is working in a risk-based manner, meaning running continuous and continuous risk assessments. We do focus our efforts on addressing really the most salient risks in our supply chains. And in order to do so, we carry out regular risk analysis, as every company that operates within this framework. And in certain cases, and that's been pushed, for example, also by developments that we've had in Germany, but also just by daily business need, doing more ad hoc assessments, looking more in depth into changing contexts in which we operate. The risk analysis that we've been conducting, they highlight typically reoccurring themes, priority areas for us then, such as discrimination, freedom of association, forced labor, child labor, occupational health and safety. So no real surprises on that side. But also when prioritizing which issues then to address first, we do consider multiple factors, including geography, where it occurs, industry-specific concerns, but also the direct insights that we gather through our day-to-day work in supply chains and through various mechanisms that connect us to where those issues actually occur.
Let's get an example though, because you've got to, as you said in that answer, prioritize. So there will be some above the line and some below the line. And you said in that answer it was context specific, including in relation to geography. So give us an example where something has been above the line for you, as salient for you as a company, and how you've decided that.
Of course. So one of the specific supply chains that we've been focusing on for quite a while, because of these risk assessments and also direct insights that we have gathered, is our tropical produce, and in that specifically the banana supply chain. And in order to understand then how we also operate and what that means for how we then need to deal with specific risk and adverse impacts, I might want to take a step back to give a bit of an understanding of how we operate with our business partners and how we are connected in the supply chain. ALDI usually does not source directly from a banana plantation or a factory. You very often have intermediaries in between who are then also tasked with contracting and selecting those producers in the end. Hence, they take a very important role in translating our expectations, our code of conduct into reality. And one way of how we are doing that and monitoring that is our supply evaluation program, which really picks up on what do we expect in the beginning from the supplier to watch out for, what are the core standards and risk that we expect them to monitor, how are they set up to do so. And that works, in a fairly standard way. You're questioning them, you get your response, but then I think the really important bit is also working with them on site, understanding how do they work with producers, how do they translate our requirements into reality, observing that and feeding that then back into the decisions that our buying teams are then taking in the end, and how they allocate volumes across our supply base to ensure that we are driving this continuous improvement with them and are really focusing on those business partners with really strong practices. And this has been...
So the next bit of due diligence, of course, is prevent and mitigate. So you've identified on the banana plantations that there are these human rights concerns. You're saying that you're very much relying on your relationship with the supplier organizations, both to understand that and to manage it. You're obviously talking to your suppliers, but how do you then know that there is actual prevention and mitigation on the plantations amongst the producers themselves?
Absolutely. So maybe let me stick for a little bit with this process and then go into a specific example that also showcases how it then works in reality when issues arise. What I mentioned in terms of our supply evaluation program, it does include this direct presence of the supplier together with ALDI on the farms, getting that direct insight into not just looking at SAQ or self-assessment questionnaire responses from a supplier, but taking that into the context of a specific farm and looking at, right, how are these processes and monitoring systems actually being implemented? What do we observe in terms of, do we have a functioning grievance mechanism in one of these producer organizations? And multiple other aspects that need to be ensured to, in the end, uphold our commitments to labor rights here. There has been a recent case that was brought up actually back in 23, where the NGO Oxfam picked out at the outset of the German Supply Chain Act becoming effective every German retailer and presented them with a quite elaborate case on what they had discovered on different banana plantations across Latin America. While I can't speak to what others had been presented with, we saw quite detailed allegations of inadequate wages, obstruction of union work, inadequate safety measures when applying pesticides while workers were in the farms during working hours. And that obviously for us then triggered a quite substantive investigation procedure, again, benefiting from the fact that already through our regular and standard processes, we and our suppliers are present in production and have a good understanding of what the situation typically looks like and should look like. And that enabled us then in the end to also, in this particular case, operate as a mediator between different parties, meaning the supplier, involved unions, and also the organization that brought the accusation forward on behalf of the local rights holders. So this was not an easy process. It took a lot of time, it took a lot of engagement, but through this engagement and having very open and frank dialogue about what is the expectation, what has been observed, and why does it make sense for everyone to move ahead on this, we've actually seen some very strong progress also on the remediation piece then, as in August this year, there were actually wage repayments as I think a very clear outcome of this remediation effort. And there was strong commitment to also ensure that the other aspects that were part of this improvement plan then were resolved. I was talking about health and safety aspects in the beginning there as well. So this was a very concrete example.
That's a brilliant example, by the way. And clearly there had been wage theft and then the wages were repaid. You couldn't get a more clear example of there being redress. But there'll be a lot of people listening whose eyebrows will be raised that the company was actually the trusted mediator in difficult discussions between local producers and suppliers. In a lot of these discussions in the global north by activists, they sort of accuse companies of being the evil enemy almost. And yet here you were able to make a positive difference. Did you really feel that? And what lessons did you learn from that?
I mean, yes, we in terms of feeling, yes, we saw our role as the mediator, but then I think it's also important to look at the distribution of responsibilities as these new due diligence legislations like the German Supply Chain Act bring them forward. This is a natural role for a company like ours, but I think you have to also acknowledge that you're not always able to go into this level of engagement, be it from the investigation side down to resolving the case with every single case. I think the big learning for us here is looking towards more collaborative efforts in order to be able to also resolve this. Because just looking at the recent debates that we had and maybe opening up also around what due diligence legislation might be perceived to do also to smaller companies, I would not want to necessarily imagine what that would mean for a company that does not have the resources like a large retailer or any other type of large business. So I think the key learning for us is looking for more ways how to solve these type of cases collaboratively. but then really looking also beyond the individual case, how to work together to systemically address the issues that we run into.
Yes, and that was the second part of my question, really, which is the prevent bit. Having identified the issue, dealt well with the grievance on the ground, there are lessons there to prevent. You're saying that's in collaboration. Uh, uh, I know we're in a short podcast and we're trying to cover lots of ground, but it's easy to say collaboration, isn't it? So can you perhaps give us a sort of fresh take on maybe that example and another one about how you then translate the lessons into prevention?
So one aspect is that, for us individually as a company, we have already established this process of trying to understand the setup of our suppliers, verifying that on site, and playing that also back into buying decisions to when we do observe gaps, that these also are connected to a strong motivation to close them, because that ultimately will have an impact on who we prioritize as our business partners in the long term. Looking at more collaborative efforts, I think there's a couple of really good examples. Also looking, for example, at the work that the Ethical Trading Initiative is doing by really opening up fora to jointly work on sectoral issues that are being identified. And one example of how this joint collaboration then can look like, and that really ties everything from identification down to remediation and further prevention then also together, are joint impact assessments, which we've seen a couple of them now also out in the public, and which not only makes sense from achieving impact at greater scale, but also just by pooling resources, enabling companies of different sizes and types to work together, and making due diligence then also less onerous.
One of my questions was going to be, you've given us a brilliant example of the benefits of human rights due diligence, but you're a huge company and you're looking across all those multiple sectors non-stop. And then I was going to ask, how can, what sort of government systems have you got in place to ensure that you are finding those issues across the board and on a continuous basis? But in fact, what you've just said is that that's an ambition not just for your company, but for working with other companies and sector-wide if we're really going to deal with systemic problems. Have I understood that right? And have you got any insight into that?
Exactly. So obviously the company internal governance and setups is critical to ensure that, I think these days we are operating in a compliant manner. And we have to take care of our own identified risks / the risks in our supply chains. That is something that we need to obviously deal with on a continuous basis, and ensure that the systems we set up internally do learn and help us to identify that. And there's so many different processes that are in place to do that, from your, although obviously disputed third-party audits across the production base that nevertheless give you certain insights into what is happening, to then having your own eyes and ears on the ground, feeding that into internal processes again, and not just resolving at the individual case level, but really supporting overall adjustment then of prevention mechanisms. But you can only get so far, because typically you're never the only client of an individual factory or farm, and very often it's very systemic issues that we run into, where we do also need to have the involvement of, for example, local governance to resolve certain contextual factors that an individual economic actor will not be able to resolve. So we've been partnering in many different supply chain specific collaborations, ranging from different commodity specific efforts to these more overarching efforts, which are being driven by actors like the Ethical Trading Initiative, all always with a certain focus on what can we do together as companies. But then when we engage in specific countries, also what is the context looking like here? What are the enabling or maybe also hindering factors from how topics like recruitment are being organized in a country where if the context around your production base is not right, it will be very hard to systemically ensure that you see the necessary improvement. So it's a, I think, fine balance between what do you need to do as a company by yourself, but also where do you need the others? And again, why is that level playing field and that push for really systemic improvement so important?
I know that you and all of us don't do this just for reputation management. All the people I know who work in businesses on human rights are genuinely, authentically committed to the cause. But there are a lot around the whole issue of due diligence who say, this is good reputation management. When you made a series of changes as a big retail group a few years ago, you shot up 18 points in the NGO Oxfam's ranking of international supermarkets, fair or unfair. We won't question that today. And I also mentioned some of the external rankings that you have right at the outset of this podcast. How much does that matter to you? How much do you try and manage that? How much would you be critical of some of those rankings? Because you're not doing it for perception, and I don't want to suggest that in any way, but perception is discussed in this space. So I wanted to have a chance to see how you think about that and how you think about the ecosystem, if we can call it that, in relation to it.
Absolutely. It's a very fair point. And I think that organizations like Oxfam, they've played a crucial role in raising awareness, both among the public, but also companies, for the importance of human rights due diligence. So the rankings can definitely help to draw attention to this critical issue. Now, I do understand that there is also a desire to quantify progress and use that to drive progress as well. Particularly by comparing efforts between companies. But this quantification may not always be the best way to bring also priority to where resources should actually be focused. So when it comes to measuring the value of what we do on human rights, these rankings do give you obviously a certain insight into who's active. But then whether you should count the number of certain assessments that is being done, I think that's a different discussion to be had, and we've all had a lot of learnings during the last years. But I think definitely making sure these topics land higher up on the corporate agenda and get more visibility is a positive outcome. Just reflecting on what these type of rankings want to do, achieving in the end better working conditions, across our supply chains. I guess that's what we're all in for. There's a number of different tools that also we as a company then leverage for ourselves to see like where do we actually make progress. And there we rely on tools like worker surveys, grievance mechanisms, and other forms of direct engagement that give us insight. Which in the end are really important for us to see where we are moving the needle and where we are not doing that. And just from a very personal observation, again, like this might be extremely subjective, and I'm not quite sure if that really matches with all of the ongoing benchmarks, but we have seen a stronger focus more and more on relying on frameworks like the German Supply Chain Act to drive very targeted action. And I gave you an example of that just before with Oxfam probing into the banana supply chain. And that has really given companies a way to demonstrate how they are set up and how they are willing to then engage when these topics actually materialize. And I think that's what in the end also helps us to learn what works, what doesn't work, what's effective, what's not effective, and what type of understanding do we need to also deal and resolve these situations.
And what I say talking to you both today and in advance of this is the non-defensive attitude of ALDI South. When you were presented with that example, instead of what would have happened in companies 10 and 15 years ago, some denial, trying to run away, a complete acceptance. Look, there's something serious here. Let's have a look at it. And I think that's something different in this era amongst many companies that are pursuing human rights. Now, I did promise you I would allow you to come back to the European Union negotiations at the moment. We're actually in the last days at the moment of negotiations on the EU Omnibus, which includes its corporate sustainability due diligence directive. ALDI South Group has taken a pretty firm stand in its advocacy on that. You're watching it carefully. You and most of our audience don't need me to describe more. We're much more interested in hearing from you exactly where you stand now and why.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving us also that opportunity. It's a topic that is, really close to us and dear to us, and we've been very active over the past few months. Maybe taking a step back again, as a major retailer, our supply chains impact people every day, millions of them all around the world. And we do understand that respecting human rights and protecting the environment are non-negotiable and integral to our core operations. And it's expected of us. It's also expected more and more legally of us, but to varying degrees in different geographies in which we operate. So it's essential that we foster a fair and enabling environment that really encourages collective action among businesses in order to be able to address also these often systemic challenges in our supply chains. And this is also why we've seen something like the CSDDD as a great potential to harmonize standards and prevent a fragmented landscape of national laws. We've welcomed the Commission's ambition now with the CSDDD and the Omnibus process to reduce administrative burden. I think that's always a very laudable cause. But how? So while also the extension of deadlines that was discussed is something where we said might be a good thing to really allow for a meaningful legislative process to engage and also provide companies with the necessary time to maybe clarify certain concepts and then understand how to better implement. We had concerns then when we saw the proposals by the different parties now in the process that some of the changes could actually introduce unnecessary administrative burdens for companies, not really staying very true to a risk-based approach. We have had experiences of our own, what that could mean in terms of the need to collect data, analyze data, but not necessarily with a way that enables you to prioritize the right sectors, but rather be a bit stuck maybe with this tier one focus. We've been supporting the legislation's initial intent to establish a level playing field for effective and meaningful human rights diligence across the European Union. But changes to this initial intent and initial setup of the directive really need to ensure that we still stay in line with international instruments such as the UNGP and OECD guidelines. And this is so important since what Europe has been trying to set up here really gives you the framework for a solid management system that helps you to comply with legislations a bit everywhere. I mean, we do see much more outcome-oriented legislation in terms of just prescribing a result that you need to achieve by not importing goods made with forced or child labor into specific markets. But not necessarily talking about the system that you should be putting in place to do that. So we really had two worlds meeting and coming together and potentially providing a good overall framework. And we still are quite positive that we have proposals on the table now that could enable that. which is why we've been engaging quite actively throughout the past months to explain to decision makers where we think the proposals might have unintended consequences in terms of actually increasing some administrative burden and not allowing effective due diligence. So in short, the points that are really critical for us now to carry through the trilogue and hopefully then see in the final version of the CSDDD are enabling companies to adopt this full risk-based approach in accordance with the international standards so that we can really focus on the most severe and salient risks in supply chains and take strategic approaches to higher risk sectors rather than just to individual suppliers. We recognize the importance that we shouldn't be overburdening SMEs and are very sympathetic to putting clear guardrails in place for that. But that needs to be done in a way that it still allows companies along the supply chain to collaborate and also request the relevant information that you need to understand who's actually doing what and how are we set up.
There's a long answer there, and thank you for it. What I'm hearing from that is you're very much for the risk-based approach and worried for those that are still arguing that it could be restricted to tier one suppliers. I'm hearing that on the potential restrictions on what can be asked from suppliers that are being proposed, that you understand the motivation, you're not unsympathetic to the motivation of that, but you're very worried that it's going to impair the ability of the company and companies together, working together to be able to do their work. Is there any compromise there that you could suggest or see that might properly balance both interests?
In terms of the positions that we see right now, I think what the Parliament introduced in terms of a risk-based approach can work. But now it's really about how do we define this barrier for requesting information to SMEs. And I've heard different positions here. Two quick thoughts on this are: one, allowing that information requests are still possible. Then something that the Commission introduced initially with the omnibus proposal was reliance or restricting to the VSME standard. Now I've heard that there is actually work on maybe revising that standard and looking at introducing more contents that would allow to understand work in the supply chain rather than just work in own operations, which sounds like a reasonable approach. A space to be observed. I think the critical piece now will be to make sure that this cap or this barrier to information request will be very carefully crafted to allow for critical information to still flow.
And what you didn't comment on, unless I missed it, was just this big reduction in scope. It's now going to be a much higher level number of companies that are directly affected than was originally proposed in the legislation. Given your size, you're in it anyway, I know. But in terms of it being in your interest and also the values that you've been espousing in this podcast on behalf of ALDI South Group, is that diminution a huge setback for the growth of human rights due diligence by companies in the world, or is it still a step forward?
I think in the end, we will still see a step forward. And there's been a lot of different debates on what will this do to the trickle-down effect of expectations. And that is really why we are stressing so much the necessity to enable this collaboration between larger and smaller companies and making sure that it is really targeted but still possible to ensure that due diligence can take place where it really matters. And that is really what we are focusing on right now.
In this podcast, we've heard that ALDI South Group has a huge international retail chain, but with their suppliers, they are present on the farms. They're able to understand issues because they meet the directly affected stakeholder. We heard the example they gave of potential adverse human rights impact in the banana supply chain, and how when they investigated it, it ended up that they were the trusted mediator between local producers and suppliers. And the real learning that they got from that example was in the importance of collaboration going ahead, not least to prevent future human rights violations. Niklas talked about supply chain specific collaborations, being really important to deal with what are systematic approaches, including the opportunity to do joint human rights impact assessments. And when we talked about the way that his company, but companies generally are perceived in the way that they deal with human rights, he welcomed the fact that the issues are raised up the priority list. But he said the most important determinants for ALDI South Group themselves were worker surveys and employee engagement that actually enabled them to track the impact of what they do. In the last part of the podcast, we talked about these last days of negotiations about the EU Omnibus and Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Niklas gave a strong endorsement for the directive, the principle of the directive, saying that human rights due diligence is non-negotiable and expected in the markets in which they work. Some of the outstanding concerns that he raised included trying to get a right balance in relation to information requests, both that his company needs, but which are needed in terms of what he called the strategic collaboration, which is needed between larger and smaller companies if these human rights issues are to be dealt with. It's been a fascinating discussion, Niklas. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I think you've given huge insight to our audience. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us on the Frankly Speaking podcast.
Thank you very much for having us.
You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Responsible Business podcast from Frank Bold. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again to Niklas Wehner and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.